Hi there everyone, and welcome to the 8th tutorial in the Design for Beginners tutorial series. And in this video we're going to take a look at something which will make it a lot easier for us when we are in a future tutorial going to save the player's position. Now what I'm talking about is multidimensional arrays as well as enums. Now before we take a look at those, I want you to note that I actually changed some of the code while being offline, and the things that I did was to remove the color defines found above here. I also removed the onPlayer command text one, which was /dice, and basically I did it because I think we do not need it, and we could also just use send client message to all instead of loop through all and send them a client message. I also removed the addPlayer class one, which was above the one we created. I changed the print lines in the main callback. I also had to change the onPlayer request class to match the addPlayer class. So now it's actually looking at this class here when you choose. So now you can only choose one, and you click on spawn and you should spawn at where you actually choose it. Now I also want to teach you what a scope means. Now if I were to create a variable inside on-game mode init, for instance, then that variable would only have access to this scope, which means that this variable can only be used within this function. Now this is usually called a local variable, and usually you have no specific syntax for it. You just write an appropriate name. So if you want something like a bullet, you would do bullet. So this is a new bullet. However, if you want a variable to be able to be accessed from several functions, you can make it a global one, and to do so, all you would have to do is to create it outside all the other functions, and this would make it a global variable, which would mean that it have a really good scope. So usually you write a G and then the name, and the G1 stands for global, so then you know that it's a global and not a local variable. Now we're going to create a new one, so we're going to allocate memory for it and initialize it, and actually this is going to be the amount of vehicles the user has. So this is going to be vehicles, a G vehicles, and we're going to do G player vehicles, and this is going to be a single one, a single array, and he will be able to have 4 vehicles. So now the first one perhaps is 411, which is, I believe, the Infernus, and then you have another car, and so forth. Now the problem is that if you were to give this player or a particular player this variable, then if you were to assign a slot, let's say the first one, and then someone else would like to have a car as well, if you wrote over that slot, then everyone would have the same vehicles. So how would you fix this? Well, one way would be to do new G player vehicles underscore the name of the player and so forth. No, I'm just kidding. That would be a pain in the ass. So what you really need is multi-dimensional arrays. And what this is going to make possible is that if you write 2 more brackets, then what you actually can do is to add another value here, and this is going to be the key or the index to these variables found within here. So if we wrote 1, for instance, then the 1 would have all these variables for itself. Then if we do 2, it will also have its own variables, which would be the maximum amount of 4. Now the good thing with this is actually that we can change this to max players, and this is defined, which is a native one, which basically defines the amount of players the maximum amount of players of San Andreas multiplayer, and that will make it possible to give these 4 values to all the players. Now, one thing which makes it even cooler is something which is called an enum. Before we do that, I want to change the name of this one to player info, and this is going to be used to store the player's information, which we will later in a future tutorial going to save. Now, to create an enum, you do enum, you then give it a name, and before I give it a name, I want to tell you what an enum is. Basically, if you do not know for sure what kind of variables you want here, then you can create something which is kind of like a blueprint, which is an enum. And this enum is going to have not variables, because you cannot really initialize it, the variables which within the enum, but they are more like constants. So you can think of it like a blueprint. So then you could use gPlayerInfo, then the player's ID, and then you would do, well, I'll show you. We're just going to name this pBluePrint. We then have these curly brackets, which you normally find in a function. You then end it like an instruction, or yes, an instruction, and then you just add variables inside this one, and instead of 4 here, you would do pBluePrint. So now you could actually do gPlayerInfo, then the player ID of the player, and then what you could do is just, instead of pBluePrint, you would just add a variable which is found within this enum. Now, for instance, we might want a float which says the player's X position, Y position, as well as Z position. That will be the first values that we're going to store. So now if we save and compile, we would get a warning, of course, because we do not actually use the variable, but everything works. Now what you can do is to actually initialize this one and give each player, which is max players, all these variables a value. So you could do, for instance, if you go down on player connect, you could do player info, and then you would do player ID, because that's the ID that we want to be using. And then we'll do px, and then we can initialize it to something like 5.0. And that's really useful. And remember, this was a global one, so we're just going to add a G here as well. So what this is going to do, this is going to take the player ID that just connected. It's going to give this ID to this variable, and then it's going to, with that ID, it's going to set the player's X position with that ID to 5. So then this one, px, is going to be 5, but only for that particular ID. So that's basically enums as well as multidimensional arrays. And in the next tutorial, we're actually going to carry on with this system, which will make it possible for us in the future to save the player's position. So thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.